Hey guys, this is Brian from OBEDIA, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about miking up a snare drum and recording your snare, and a couple different practices that we can use for miking a snare. Now, when you're miking a snare drum, there's really two different ways to approach miking a snare. The first one is a method that we're all familiar with, and that's something I'm using here, and that's miking your snare from the top. This is something that you're going to use in a live situation very often and also in the studio, and this will usually yield very good results. Now, I'm using a fairly basic microphone. I'm using a Shure SM57. It's a regular dynamic microphone. It doesn't require a 48-volt power supply or anything like that. Now, the reason I'm not using a condenser mic is simply because you really don't need to use a condenser microphone or a microphone that requires a power source when you're recording drums. Drums are very loud instruments in general. And so because of that, we're fine using a regular dynamic mic, and you can choose any one you would like. Now, I'm using just a mic stand right now, and I've placed my mic relatively close to my snare, and this should provide fairly good results. You don't necessarily need to put the mic in any specific place in reference to the drum. You'll want to find the sound that works best for you. And of course you need to be able to play the drum, so you're going to typically be placing your microphone somewhere on the edge of your drum. You don't want to be putting a mic right here or anything like that. You can't get in the way of the player. Now that brings me to another way that we can mic up a snare drum, and let's talk about that a little bit as well. Now, another way of recording a snare drum is to use the bottom method. Now, this can differ in the results that you're going to get overall when you create your recording. And the reason for this is that the top of a snare drum sounds different from the bottom of a snare drum. And that's just because of many different reasons, depending on the top skin that you're using as opposed to the bottom skin. You're also going to have a microphone closer to your snare wires when you're set up this way, but you can get a nice tight sound out of a bottom snare drum. Now, often in a studio situation, it can be really useful to record both the top and the bottom of your snare drum. If you are not able to do that, I usually say that you should be just fine recording the top of your drum. But as you can see right here, what I've done is I've taken my SM57 and I've placed it again somewhere near the edge of the drum, and you'll want to experiment with what's going to give you the best output for your overall recording on your snare drum when you do things this way. Again, this is really a personal preference kind of a thing, and it depends on how much gear you might have, if you have enough microphones to cover this and various things like that. But just experiment with microphone placement. I like to get a mic nice and tight right underneath the snare, not incredibly close to the skin, but close enough that we're going to be able to pick up that sound. And remember, a snare drum is a really loud instrument, so in its nature, you're definitely going to get a good recorded signal out of pretty much either end of your snare drum. Okay, so we're back to the top microphone miking method now on my snare drum, and that's because, as I say, I very often use top miking for my drums, and that's because it's quick, it's easy, and I know it produces the results that I'm looking for. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set up a track in Studio One, and in Studio One we will go ahead and just record some hits from this snare and see what they look like using the top mic method. Okay, so we're rolling on Studio One. Now remember, you're going to want to find a good volume level for your microphone. This is all going to depend on how hard you're playing, various things like that. But let's go ahead and just hit a couple times on the snare and see what we get. And just for good measure, let's go ahead and also do a bottom snare recording so that we can compare those two and see how they sound. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, there we go. So now we can compare these two waveforms, and let's see how everything sounds. Now I've chosen to use PreSonus Studio One, but you can use any audio workstation that you're comfortable with because these conventions are really going to remain true in just about any situation that you might be working in. So I have my two recorded signals now, and let's see how these sound. So here's my top mic'd snare drum. Sounds pretty good right out of the gate. It's maybe lacking a little bit of definition and crispness, but I can bring that in later on with some equalization. Let's listen to the bottom mic'd snare. So you can hear the difference between those two snare recordings very distinctly. On the bottom snare recording, it's much more crisp and defined, however, it lacks a little bit of body. I can hear those snare wires really heavily. In contrast, in my top mic'd snare, the sound is a little deeper. It's lacking a little bit of that definition, but in both of these cases, I can bring out some of this sound by using some equalization. So let's add an EQ now to my snare drum track. So I'm just going to go ahead and make use of the Pro EQ, and I'll just click it and drag it and drop it directly onto the inserts for my snare. And now I have a fresh EQ ready to go. Now, anytime that you're listening to a snare drum recording, or really any recording that you might happen to be EQing, you really want to just play back, listen, make some changes, play back, listen some more. Now, in the case of my top snare recording, I know that it sounds like it has a little too much low end. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to engage the low cut and the low frequency half of my EQ. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of roll off a little bit of the low end immediately. And let's hear how that sounds just with that low end rolled off. Okay, well, there's a little bit of low end out, but it's still lacking some definition. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in a little bit of high and a little bit of mid to high range in my EQ, and let's see how that sounds. Alright, so that sounds a lot better already. Again, let's listen to this with no equalization. And here's with equalization. You can see I've not really made a whole lot of drastic changes in my EQ. I have sort of a slow ramp up going on here. I have my initial low end rolled off a little bit, and then as I move up, I've brought in a little bit of high end, not too much, but enough to get some definition out of my snare drum. So that sounds pretty good. Now, this might benefit from a little bit of compression as well, so let's go ahead and grab a compressor. We're going to drag this again into our inserts. Now we have a compressor ready to go. Now, because I'm dealing with, again, a very loud instrument, I probably don't need to compress a whole lot. So let's try a pretty basic setting. We're going to go ahead and use a ratio of, let's say, about 3:1 or so. And we'll set our threshold. We'll go ahead and leave it at about 15 decibels and see what happens. Let's play this back. So I can hear that compressor doing its job right there and forcing down the volume of this snare sound as I play it back. So let's play this back with no compression, and then we'll listen to it with. So the compressor has added a good amount of definition to my recording there, and you can see I've just changed my threshold a little bit. And you'll want to play with this to find a setting that you like the most when it comes to reducing the overall signal. I've also changed my ratio a little bit. So in this case, what this means is that for every 5.5 or so decibels, which I go above my threshold, I'm going to reduce by 1 decibel.
And so this is going to keep some of my tones in control, but it's also going to add a little bit more body to my overall recording. So that is a fairly good setting right there for this snare. Now, of course, I can add other effects. I can add reverbs, I can add delays, things like that, but that all comes down to personal preference. And of course, when it comes to adding an EQ or a compressor to a recorded signal, whether it be a snare drum or any other instrument, it's really going to depend on the recording that you have gotten and also on your own personal preference for the sound that you happen to be going for your recorded signal. So let's go ahead and just listen real quickly to my settings on my bottom snare. And again, because the bottom snare is recorded differently, there's a good chance that I would have to make some changes to both my EQ and my compressor settings. So let's play this back right now. We'll just select a loop region. And now I'm going to go ahead and play back the sound of my snare a little bit on the bottom. We can hear that is extremely bright. In fact, it is way too bright. And it was too bright to start with, and we kind of knew that this was going to be the case. So in the case of my bottom recorded snare, in actuality, I probably want to use something to the inverse of what I did for my top mounted snare. So in this case with my EQ, I'm going to go ahead and disable my low cut, and I'm actually going to go ahead and add a little bit of low to my overall snare recording right here. And I'm going to, in this case, engage my high cut, and I'm going to do a little bit of high cut on this snare recording and just take out a little bit of the highs. And I'm not going to amp those mids up too much either. Let's see what this sounds like. And I'm also going to disable my compressor for right now. So there we go. In this case, I've used the inverse of what I did on my top-mounted microphone recording, and I've added a little bit more bass to this snare bottom recording in order to get a little bit more definition and bring out and remove some of that crispness that is just a little too overbearing when it comes to my overall recording. So this is something that, again, all comes down to your own personal preference when it comes to your recorded signal. But this is something I like to use for any kind of bottom-mounted recorded snare. Let's go ahead and engage our compressor and see how we feel about the settings that we're using for our compressor. So that's definitely coming through nice and hot. Now, I might want to be a little bit more extreme with my compression in this case. So in this case, I have a ratio set of about 1.8. Let's just call it 2 to 1. So for every 2 decibels or so that I might go above my threshold in my recorded signal, I'm going to reduce the signal by 1 decibel. So this is a good way to approach compression, is really to just play back and listen and change the sound as you move along. And you'll find that as you make some changes, especially to your ratio and your threshold, you'll really start to hear the difference in your recorded signal, and you'll be able to find a nice happy medium for your recording. Now again, all of this is relative, and it all depends on your own personal preference that you like for your recorded signal, and of course the instrument that you've recorded, the type of miking, and various things like that. But these are some very good principles for recording and EQing a snare drum. As always, you'll want to have some fun with any type of recording, experiment with your plugins, experiment with your EQs and your compressors, and find the setting which works best for you as you are recording and mixing. I hope that this has been useful to you guys. As always, please stay in touch with me. My email is brian@obedia.com. Find me on Twitter at twitter.com/OBEDIA-tutor and on Facebook at facebook.com/OBEDIA-tutor. Thank you so much for watching. Happy mixing to you, and I'll see you guys next tutorial.